With this video, we're going to be talking about the kingdom Animalia, which you should be familiar with because you are one. So from the fossil record, we can determine that the first animals appeared on Earth approximately 1.2 billion years ago. So 0.8 billion years after we had our first life on Earth, prokaryotic, we see the arrival of animals. These first animals were very simple organisms, similar to the sponges that we see in the oceans today. So these first organisms that we have are going to be similar to sea sponges in that they probably lack tissues, which means that they definitely didn't have any kind of organs that we're familiar with today, and we're probably filter feeders like the ones that we see in our oceans. Now we're talking the domain here for the kingdom Animalia should be obvious. We should remember is the domain eukarya, which means that all of these cells have nucleuses and organelles bound to the membrane. And what's going to be important here in this first part of the animal video is that we get the characteristics that define all animals. So no matter how simple or complex, all animals have certain characteristics in common. They are all multicellular, which means that they're made up of more than one cell. They're all eukaryotic, right, which means their cells have a nucleus which protects the DNA, and they all have membrane-bound structures with specialized jobs called organelles, and they are all heterotrophic because they must consume other organic materials to get energy, right? So their cells cannot make their own food, so they don't undergo photosynthesis, none of that. And all of these terms should be a review because we've been talking about them for the last couple of weeks now, right? So another characteristic that we use to define the different groups of animals, right, is the symmetry that the animal demonstrates. So all animals show similarities in body design and patterns of development. Looking at these patterns, we can suggest an evolutionary relationship among all animals, right? So here's a cladogram pictured on the top left. In the cladogram, we see the 9 different phylos of animals, right? The phylum, 9 different phylum, right? Plural is going to be phyla. We have 9 different categories or phyla under the kingdom Animalia, and each one contains animals with similar characteristics. So we have the 9 groups, the first being the sponges, the sea sponges, the ones that we talked about, which are going to resemble the first animals that ever came on Earth. Then you have the cnidarians, right, commonly referred to as jellyfish, flatworms, roundworms, annelids, another type of worm, arthropods, mollusks, echinoderms, and chordates. So you see here in our cladogram on the top left, you see multicellular being the derived trait of all animals. Then the first trait that we come to is tissues. Before we get to tissues, we have the sponge group coming off of the kingdom Animalia. So that means sponges do not have true tissues while all other groups do. Then the second branch that we come to is either radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry. Radial symmetry means that the parts are all arranged around a central point, meaning that if you cut this organism in half in any direction, you would get matching sides. Bilateral symmetry is when there's only one way to divide the organism so that you have mirror image halves. So something with eyes is always going to be bilateral symmetry because you can only cut it in half down the middle so that you have matching sides. Well, a radial symmetry, something like a jellyfish, which is just a circle, you can cut it any direction and it'll be the same on each side. So like most organisms on the planet, through mutation and natural selection, animals have changed over time as they adapted to new and changing environments. Eventually, early animals ventured onto land, which prevented several struggles for the animals. There's a lack of support because they're not contained in a water or an aquatic environment. They have to deal with water loss because they're not surrounded by water. And there's going to have to be new methods of reproduction. The vertebrate or invertebrates. One feature used to describe animals is whether they have a backbone or not. The majority of animals are invertebrates, which means they do not have a backbone. Animals like us are vertebrates, which means that they have a backbone. So if you want to feel your back right now, you should be able to feel your spine, which means that you're a vertebrate. The vertebrates can be divided into 5 classes. So we're talking about just one phylum called Chordata, and which can be divided into 5 classes that we should be familiar with. Each class has its own unique set of characteristics. We have fish, right? So fish is going to be our first class that begins the phylum Chordata, and every class in this group is going to have a backbone. Then we have amphibians, represented by the salamander here, and those are going to be different from fish because they are the first group to appear with lungs. Then we have reptiles, represented by the snake, and they're going to have amniotic eggs, which means they lay eggs that contain an amniotic sac. Branching off from the reptiles, we have birds, which distinguish themselves by having feathers. Then we get to the mammals, which are the last group that we come to, and they are the only group that have fur. So that's going to end this video. Please make sure to watch the second part, which we get to talk about animal adaptation.